My shift at this Texas cafeteria wasn't just about serving food. It was about survival. Every creak, every flicker of the lights, every unexplained event meant a new rule was being enforced by something else. You won't believe what happened when the building decided to stop playing by any rules at all. It started innocuously enough, as these things always do. I needed the money, and the Ironwood Industrial Complex needed a night porter for their massive, labyrinthine cafeteria. It sits in the dead center of the West Texas scrubland, about 40 miles from the nearest town that could genuinely call itself a city. During the day, the heat is a physical weight, a shimmering hammer that pounds against the corrugated metal roof. But at night, the desert temperature plummets, and the building seems to inhale that cold, holding it in the corners like a secret. I remember my interview with the site manager, a jittery man named Mr. Vance who couldn't seem to stop rubbing a scar on his left forearm. He didn't ask about my experience with industrial cleaning or my familiarity with kitchen safety protocols. He asked if I was good at following instructions to the letter. Not the general spirit of the rules, he clarified, but the exact, specific letter. I told him I was. I lied. I've always been the type to cut corners if it meant finishing 10 minutes early. That laid-back attitude is usually harmless. Here, it was almost a death sentence. The cafeteria itself, simply labeled Mess Hall 4, is a relic of the late 70s. It's a cavernous space filled with long, formica-topped tables and an endless array of stainless steel serving counters that gleam dully under the fluorescent lights. When the workers leave at 9 p.m., the silence that descends is heavy. It's not a peaceful quiet. It's the holding of breath. The hum of the industrial refrigerators becomes a roar in the vacuum, and the ice machine in the corner clatters with a violence that makes you jump every single time. On my first night, I arrived just as the sun was bleeding out over the horizon, painting the scrub brush in violent shades of violet and orange. The heat was still rising off the asphalt, distorting the air, but inside, the air conditioning was blasting at a temperature that felt arctic. I clocked in, the punch card machine making a satisfying thunk, and went to the janitorial closet. Taped to the inside of my locker was a sheet of yellow legal pad paper. It wasn't typed. It was handwritten in a jagged, frantic scrawl. The header simply read, "Current protocol for night operations." I chuckled when I first read it. I thought it was a hazing ritual for the new guy, a collection of bizarre superstitions held by the locals. Rule 1. Lock the loading dock doors by 10:15 p.m. exactly. Do not check them twice. Rule 2. If the radio in the dish pit turns on, do not turn it off. Change the station to static. Rule 3. Ignore the scratching sound from the walk-in freezer. Is the cooling fans expanding? Rule 4. Always leave the third chair on table 12 pulled out. Do not push it in. I shoved the paper into my pocket, grabbed my mop bucket, and rolled my eyes. Table 12. Static? It sounded like the script of a bad horror movie. I figured the scratching was rats, and Mr. Vance didn't want to pay for an exterminator. I set to work, the rhythmic slosh of the mop providing a comforting, mundane soundtrack to the night. For the first 2 hours, it was boring, just standard custodial work. I wiped down the sneeze guards, scrubbing away the fingerprints of oil rig workers and engineers. I emptied the trash cans, heavy with the smell of stale coffee and discarded sandwich crusts. The building groaned occasionally, the metal beams contracting in the cooling night air. But that was just physics. There were no ghosts here, just bad plumbing and cheap construction. The trouble began around midnight. I was sweeping the main dining area, pushing a wide dust mop across the linoleum tiles. I was humming a tune, lost in thought, when I reached table 12. It was located near the back, shrouded in the shadows where a bank of overhead lights had burned out. True to the weird list, one chair, a heavy metal frame thing with red vinyl padding, was pulled out, sitting at an odd angle as if someone had just stood up and walked away. My instinct for order kicked in. I didn't even think about the note in my pocket. I hooked my foot around the leg of the chair and shoved it back under the table to align it with the others. It scraped loudly against the floor, a harsh screech that echoed through the empty hall. There, I muttered to myself. Much better. I turned my back to continue sweeping. Scrape. The sound was sharp and immediate. I froze, my hands tightening on the handle of the dust mop. It came from directly behind me. Slowly, I turned around. The chair was pulled out again. A cold prickle of sweat broke out on the back of my neck. I stared at the chair, my rational mind racing for an explanation. The floor was uneven? No, the linoleum was flat. Vibrations from the HVAC system? Maybe. That had to be it. The heavy compressor on the roof probably shook the building enough to slide a loose chair. Okay, I whispered, my voice sounding thin and weak in the massive room. Uneven floor. Got it. To prove it to myself, I walked over, grabbed the back of the chair, and shoved it in hard. I leaned my weight against the table to make sure it was wedged tight. I waited. 5 seconds. 10 seconds. Nothing happened. Satisfied, I turned back to my mop. Screech. This time, the sound was aggressive. It wasn't a slide. It was a violent jerk. I whipped around. The chair wasn't just pulled out. It was overturned, lying on its side 3 feet away from the table. My heart hammered against my ribs like a trap bird. I was alone. I knew I was alone. I had locked the doors myself. I scanned the room, looking for wires, looking for a prankster hiding under a table with a fishing line. Is someone there? I called out. Look, if this is Vance, it's not funny. Silence. The only response was the low, steady drone of the vending machines. I approached the chair cautiously. Up close, the red vinyl looked almost like wet organic matter in the dim light. I reached down to right it, and as my fingers brushed the cold metal, a static shock, far more powerful than normal winter static, snapped against my skin. I yelped and recoiled. The lights in the cafeteria flickered. It wasn't a standard strobe effect. It was a wave of darkness that rolled from the kitchen out toward the dining area, extinguishing the banks of fluorescent tubes row by row, plunging the far end of the room into shadow. Then, just as quickly, they buzzed back to life, but the quality of the light had changed. It was sickly now, tinged with a greenish hue that made the ketchup bottles on the tables look like vials of dry blood. I backed away from table 12, leaving the chair where it lay. I pulled the list from my pocket, my hands shaking slightly. Always leave the third chair on table 12 pulled out. Okay, I breathed. Okay, you win. Chair stays out. I decided to move to the kitchen. The dining hall felt too open, too exposed. I needed the enclosure of the prep area, the familiarity of sinks and counters. I walked through the double swinging doors, the metal slapping shut behind me. The kitchen was a maze of stainless steel islands and hanging pots. I checked the clock. 12:15 a.m. I needed to check the inventory in the walk-in freezer. Protocol demanded it. I grabbed the clipboard hanging by the heavy, insulated door. I hesitated, my hand hovering over the latch. Rule 3. Ignore the scratching sounds from the walk-in freezer. It's just fans, I told myself. Just thermal expansion. I hauled the heavy door open. A blast of sub-zero air hit me, instantly chilling the sweat on my face. The freezer was large, filled with shells of frozen meats, bags of vegetables, and boxes of fries. The light inside was a dim, caged bulb that cast long, swinging shadows as the door moved. I stepped inside, the rubber soles of my boots gripping the frosty metal floor. I started counting boxes of hamburger patties. 1, 2, 3. Scritch, scritch, scritch. I stopped. The sound was coming from the back corner, behind a stack of boxes labeled pork loin. It sounded wet and sharp, like fingernails digging into ice. Rats, I said aloud, my voice trembling. It's just rats. But rats don't survive in 0 degrees. Not for long. And rats don't breathe. I could hear it now, underneath the hum of the cooling unit. A slow, raspy inhalation. Hoo, followed by a wet, clicking exhale. It wasn't mechanical. It was biological. And it was large. I took a step back toward the door. The scratching stopped instantly. The silence that followed was heavy with intent. It felt like being in a cage with a predator that had just woken up. I kept my eyes on that back corner, my hand reaching behind me for the door handle. My fingers brushed the cold metal of the safety release. Then, a box of frozen fries from the top shelf, at least 6 feet off the ground, didn't fall. It was thrown. It flew across the room with impossible force, smashing into the wall right next to my head, bursting open and showering me with frozen potato wedges. I didn't scream. The air was sucked right out of my lungs. I scrambled backward, slamming into the door, fumbling for the latch. I threw my weight against it, tumbling out into the kitchen and landing hard on the quarry tile floor. I kicked the freezer door shut and scrambled to my feet, backing away until I hit the prep counter. I stared at the door. Through the small, fogged-up observation window, I saw something. It was just for a second, a fleeting glimpse before the condensation obscured it entirely. It looked like a hand, but the fingers were too long, possessing too many joints, pressing flat against the glass from the inside. I stood there, panting, the cold of the freezer still clinging to my clothes. The kitchen was warm, but I was freezing. I looked at the crumpled note in my hand again. The rules weren't a joke. They weren't hazing. They were a manual for navigating a minefield. I had broken the chair rule, and the building had responded by changing the lights. I had acknowledged the sound in the freezer. I had spoken to it, and it had thrown something at me. Just survive the shift, I whispered. Just make it to 6 a.m. I looked around the kitchen. The shadows under the prep tables seemed to be stretching, elongating toward me like fingers of black smoke. The familiar scent of bleach was fading, replaced by something else. A smell like copper and ozone, the smell of an electrical fire waiting to happen, or perhaps the smell of old blood. I was about to head back to the mop closet to regroup when a loud, buzzing noise erupted from the dish pit area. I froze. It was the radio, an old boombox that the day shift guys kept on the shelf. It had turned on by itself. Currently, it was blasting an upbeat 80s pop song, the cheerful melody grotesque in the terrifying atmosphere. Rule 2. If the radio in the dish pit turns on, do not turn it off. Change the station to static. I swallowed hard. The dish pit was on the other side of the kitchen, a dark alcove full of hanging hoses and deep sinks. To get there, I had to walk past the walk-in freezer. The song began to distort. The tempo slowed down, dragging, the singer's voice dropping into a demonic baritone before speeding up into a chipmunk-like squeal. It wasn't a malfunction. The radio was being played with. I knew I had to go over there. I knew I had to touch the dial. But as I took my first step, the lights in the kitchen died completely. Total, absolute blackness. Then, from the darkness of the dish pit, the distorted music stopped abruptly. Elias. The whisper didn't come from the radio. It came from a vent directly above my head. It knew my name. This wasn't just a haunted building. This was a trap. And I had just walked in and locked the door behind me. I fumbled for my flashlight, my thumb jamming the button. The beam cut through the darkness, illuminating the floating dust motes. I swung the light toward the dish pit. There was no one there. But on the floor, wet footprints, bare human footprints, led from the drains up toward the radio. I was about to learn that the rules I had were just the beginning. The building was waking up, and it was hungry for more than just compliance. It wanted fear, and I was serving it up on a silver platter. The beam of my flashlight jittered across the quarry tiles, illuminating the wet footprints that shouldn't have been there. They were too large to be human, the toes splayed wide and the arch unervingly flat, as if whatever made them carried a weight that crushed the bone structure flat against the floor. The water filling the impressions wasn't clear. It was a murky, brackish fluid that smelled of stagnant ponds and decaying leaves, a scent that had no business existing in a sterilized industrial kitchen in the middle of the Texas desert. My heart was hammering against my ribs, a frantic rhythm that seemed to echo in the sudden silence of the room. The whisper from the vent, Elias, still hung in the air, a phantom sound that made the fine hairs on my arms stand rigid. I knew, with a certainty that bypassed logic and struck straight at my lizard brain, that I was being hunted. But the note in my pocket, that crumpled yellow sheet of lifeline, was specific. Rule 2. If the radio in the dish pit turns on, do not turn it off. Change the station to static. I forced my legs to move. Every step toward the dish pit felt like wading through molasses. The darkness was absolute, save for the cone of my light, which seemed to be getting swallowed by the shadows rather than piercing them. The dish pit was a maw of stainless steel and dangling sprayer hoses, looking like the hanging vines of a metal jungle. The radio sat on a high shelf, vibrating with the silent energy of a device that shouldn't be working. It was unplugged. The cord dangled uselessly in the air, swaying slightly as if caught in a breeze I couldn't feel. I reached up, my hand trembling so badly, almost knocked the device over. The plastic dial was slick, covered in a thin film of that same brackish slime found in the footprints. I gagged, the smell hitting me in a wave of rot, but I gripped the knob and twisted. The pop music, which had cut out moments ago, was replaced not by silence, but by a sudden, ear-splitting shriek of white noise. It was aggressive, a wall of electronic snow that filled the kitchen. But underneath the static, buried deep in the frequencies, I heard something else. It sounded like a choir of voices, screaming underwater, muffled and distant, crying out in a language that sounded like grinding stones. I stepped back, wiping my slime-covered hand on my pants. The moment the static stabilized, the oppression in the room lifted slightly. The heavy, predatory gaze I'd felt on the back of my neck eased off, retreating into the corners. The emergency lights buzzed to life, bathing the kitchen in a dim, sepia-toned glow that was barely an improvement over the dark. But at least I could see. I needed to get out of the kitchen. I needed to find a phone, a weapon, anything. I backed away toward the manager's office, a glass-walled box situated near the loading dock entrance. It was the only place that felt remotely defensible. I slipped inside and locked the door, jamming a heavy filing cabinet against it for good measure. "Okay, Elias. Think," I mutter, my voice cracking. "You're hallucinating. It's carbon monoxide. It has to be." I scanned the small office. It was cluttered with invoices and schedules. On the desk, the computer monitor was dead, but the bank of CCTV screens mounted on the wall was active. They cycled through views of the cafeteria, the dining hall, the loading dock, the hallway, the kitchen I had just fled. My eyes locked onto the screen labeled Kitchen, CM4. It showed the dish pit. I could see the radio on the shelf, but standing directly in front of it, where I had been standing 10 seconds ago, was a figure. It was tall, impossibly thin, wearing tattered rags that hung off its frame like Spanish moss. It was facing the camera. It didn't have a face, just a smooth, pale surface where features should be. And it was waving. It was waving at the camera. It was waving at me. I scrambled back, knocking a stack of binders off the desk. The figure on the screen stopped waving. It pointed a long, multi-jointed finger toward the stove on the left side of the screen. I looked at the stove CM2 monitor. A large stock pot, one I hadn't noticed before, was sitting on a burner. The gas was unlit, yet steam was rising furiously from under the lid. A new piece of paper slid out from the fax machine on the desk. The machine hadn't rung. It hadn't made a sound. The paper just extruded silently, curling onto the floor. I picked it up, my dread transforming into a cold, heavy acceptance. Addendum to night protocol. Rule 5. The staff is hungry. The midnight meal must be served by 1 a.m. Do not look inside the pot. Ladle 3 bowls. Serve to table 12, table 4, and the loading dock. Rule 6. Do not let the ladle touch the sides of the pot. It disturbs the ingredients. I looked at the clock on the wall. 12:42 a.m. The mundane reality of my job, clean the floors, empty the trash, had been completely rewritten. I wasn't a janitor anymore. I was a server for a clientele that existed in the periphery of nightmares. The building wasn't just haunting me. It was putting me to work. The realization was chilling. My safety didn't depend on hiding. It depended on how well I could perform these twisted tasks. If I refused, I had a feeling the staff would find a different source of meat for their stew. I pushed the filing cabinet aside. My hands were steady now, but it wasn't courage. It was the numbness of shock. I walked back into the kitchen. The air was hotter now, humid and smelling of sulfur and boiled cabbage. The stock pot on the stove was vibrating, the lid rattling against the rim. I approached the stove, grabbing a metal ladle from the rack. Do not let the ladle touch the sides. The rule repeated in my mind like a mantra. I reached for the bowls stacked on the prep table. They were heavy, ceramic, and cold to the touch. I lifted the lid of the pot. I tried to look away, to focus on the wall, but my eyes betrayed me. I caught a glimpse. The liquid inside was thick and gray, bubbling sluggishly. Floating in the slurry were things that looked like teeth, rusted bolts, and strips of leather that might have been... No, I wouldn't finish that thought. Carefully, agonizingly slowly, I dipped the ladle into the center of the pot. The substance was viscous, resisting the metal spoon. I lifted it out, sweat stinging my eyes, my muscles locked in tension to keep my hand from shaking. If the ladle clanged against the side, I didn't want to know what would happen. I filled the first bowl, then the second, then the third. The smell was overpowering, a mix of copper and rot that made my stomach heave. I placed the bowls on a serving tray. The kitchen was silent again, but the silence felt expectant, like an audience holding its breath before the curtain rises. Table 12 first, I whispered. I walked through the double doors into the dining hall. The green-tinged lighting had dimmed, leaving pools of darkness between the rows of tables. Table 12 was in the back, where I had encountered the chair earlier. The chair was still pulled out. I approached, the tray heavy in my hands. As I got closer, I saw that the chair wasn't empty anymore. The air above the seat was shimmering, distorting like heat haze on asphalt. A shadow sat there, a coalescence of darkness that had weight and form, but no definition. It was a silhouette cut from the fabric of the night. I placed the bowl on the table in front of the entity. My hand brushed the cold air surrounding it, and a wave of despair washed over me. A sudden, intense feeling of loneliness and sorrow so profound I almost dropped the tray. This wasn't just a ghost. This was a manifestation of every abandoned hope that had ever died in this desert. Enjoy. I choked out, the word absurd in the context. The shadow didn't move, but the level of the gray sludge in the bowl lowered by an inch. Instantly, I backed away and turned toward table 4. This table was near the windows. As I set the second bowl down, a loud thump against the glass made me jump. I looked out. Pressed against the window, illuminated by the spill of light from inside, was a coyote. But it was wrong. Its eyes were missing, replaced by hollow sockets that wept black fluid, and it was standing on its hind legs, its front paws pressing against the glass like human hands. It watched me place the bowl. I didn't wait to see if it could phase through the glass. I turned and walked fast. 2 down, 1 to go. The loading dock. The loading dock was past the kitchen, down a long concrete corridor. This was where the trucks would deliver supplies during the day. At night, it was a wind tunnel of drafts and echoing noises. I carried the last bowl, the tray trembling in my hands. The corridor seemed to stretch as I walked. The walls, painted a sterile beige, looked like they were breathing, expanding and contracting with the rhythm of the building's HVAC system. I reached a large roll-up door. It was closed, but the smaller personnel door next to it was ajar. Rule 1. Lock the loading dock doors by 10:15 p.m. exactly. I had locked it. I vividly remembered turning the deadbolt. But now, it stood open about 3 inches, a slice of absolute blackness peering in from the desert night. I set the bowl down on a crate near the door, as per the instinct that told me not to go outside. Service is complete, I said, announcing it to the empty hallway. A hand shot through the gap in the door. It was gray, calloused, and enormous. It grabbed the bowl, fingers dipping into the hot sludge without flinching, and dragged it into the darkness outside. The sound of wet slurping and crunching, like bones being ground to paste, erupted from the other side of the metal door. I backed away, my breath hitching. The mundane rules of physics and logic had completely dissolved. I wasn't just a witness to a haunting. I was an active participant. I was feeding the ecosystem of the damned. As I retreated to the kitchen, the lights flickered violently again. A loud buzzing sound, like an angry hornet's nest, erupted from the intercom system on the wall. A system that Mr. Vance had told me was disconnected years ago. BZZZT. Cleanup on aisle. Soul. Cleanup required immediately. The voice was synthesized, broken, and mocking. I stared at the floor. The tiles were shifting. The grout lines were moving. rearranging themselves into patterns, into letters. I watched in horror as the floor itself communicated the next demand. The tile spelled out, "The walk-in is too warm. They are thawing." My blood ran cold. The walk-in freezer, where the scratching had been, where the thing with the long fingers had been pressed against the glass. If the temperature was rising, if the fans were failing, whatever was inside wasn't just expanding. It was waking up, and I was the only one here to keep it inside. The realization hit me with the force of a physical blow. The building didn't care if I lived or died, but it required me to maintain the prison. I wasn't serving the ghosts. I was the warden of a jail I didn't understand, and the inmates were starting to riot. I grabbed a meat cleaver from the magnetic rack. It felt heavy and useless in my hand, a toy against supernatural forces, but it was all I had. I marched toward the freezer, the dread settling into a cold, hard knot in my stomach. The normal night rules were gone. The building was improvising now, and the script called for sacrifice. I just prayed it wasn't me. As I reached the freezer door, I saw the temperature gauge. It read 35 degrees Fahrenheit. It should have been -10. Condensation was dripping from the doorframe, pooling on the floor like sweat. And from inside, the scratching had stopped. It was replaced by a low, rhythmic thumping. Boom, 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 like a heartbeat or footsteps. I reached for the handle, knowing that opening this door would unleash something that the rules were designed to keep dormant. But if I didn't fix the temperature, the whole system would fail. I took a breath that tasted of ozone and fear, and I pulled the latch. The door swung open, not into a freezer, but into a long, dark tunnel that definitely didn't fit within the architectural blueprint of the cafeteria. The night was far from over. In fact, I think I had just clocked in for the real shift. The metal door of the walk-in freezer swung open, but the familiar, frosty shelves of frozen vegetables and box patties were gone. In their place stretched a long, cylindrical tunnel that bored straight into a darkness that defied the building's physical dimensions. The cafeteria backed up against a flat expanse of asphalt and desert scrub. There was no hill, no basement, no structure that could accommodate a corridor of this length. Yet, there it was, exhaling a breath of ancient, stagnant ice that smelled of ammonia and wet fur. I stood on the threshold, the meat cleaver trembling in my grip, my mind frantically trying to reject what my eyes were seeing. The walls of the tunnel were lined with pipes, hundreds of them, intertwined like the veins of a titan, coated in a thick layer of rime. They pulsed. I could see the frost cracking and reforming in rhythm with that deep, subterranean thumping I had heard earlier. Boom, boom, boom. The temperature gauge on the doorframe clicked. 38 degrees. They are thawing. The message from the floor, tiles, burned in my memory. I didn't know who they were, but the sheer panic radiating from the building's atmosphere told me that keeping them frozen was the only thing preventing a massacre. The cafeteria wasn't just a feeding ground. It was a containment unit, and the cooling system was failing. I took a step inside. The floor was a metal grate, and beneath it, I could hear the rushing of dark water, or perhaps something thicker. My boot clanged loudly, the sound echoing down the tunnel and returning to me distorted, sounding less like an echo and more like a mimicry. "Hello," I whispered. It was a stupid reflex. You don't greet the abyss. A hiss of steam erupted from a pipe to my left, making me jump. As the vapor cleared, I saw something scratched into the frost on the pipe surface. It wasn't writing, it was a diagram, a crude drawing of a valve, a hand, and a drop of liquid. And below it, 3 scratches. Compliance or consequences. I understood. I had to find a manual override. I had to bleed the system or reset the flow. I walked deeper into the tunnel, leaving the safety of the kitchen light behind. The darkness here was heavy, pressing against my eyeballs. My flashlight beam cut a weak path through the gloom, illuminating shapes recessed into the walls between the pipes. Alcoves. They were alcoves. I made the mistake of shining my light directly into the first one. It wasn't empty. Encased in a thick, semi-transparent block of ice was a figure. It wore a uniform, a gray jumpsuit similar to mine, but tattered and stained. The face was frozen in a scream, the mouth wide open, eyes rolled back into the skull, but wasn't dead. As the light hit the ice, the figure's finger twitched. The thaw was working fast. The ice was sweating, slick rivulets of water running down the front of the block. I could hear a wet, slushy sound coming from inside the casing, the sound of stiff muscles forcing themselves to move. I scrambled backward, nearly tripping over my own feet. Okay, fix the cold. Fix the cold. I chanted, my voice rising in hysteria. I ran deeper into the tunnel, ignoring the other alcoves, ignoring the shapes that were becoming increasingly less human the further I went. Some had too many limbs. Others seemed to be masses of teeth and hair. They were all stirring. The tunnel was waking up, and the sound of cracking ice was becoming a deafening cacophony, like the breaking of 1,000 bones. About 50 yards in, impossible. I was physically in the parking lot now, by any rational metric. I found it. A massive, rusted wheel valve set into the center of a junction of pipes. It was covered in jagged spikes of ice, and it was leaking a neon blue gas that hissed violently. I grabbed the wheel with both hands. It was freezing, a cold so intense it burned like fire. I gritted my teeth and heaved. It didn't budge. Come on, I screamed, slamming my shoulder into it. Behind me, from the direction of the alcoves, I heard a wet thud. Something had fallen out of the ice and hit the grating. Then came the sound of dragging. Scrape, slap, scrape, slap. Panic, raw and primal, flooded my veins. I looked at the valve. There was a locking mechanism, a pin that had been driven through the spoke. I hammered at it with the handle of the meat cleaver, sparks flying as steel hit frozen iron. The pin shattered. I grabbed the wheel again. My hands were numb, my skin sticking to the freezing metal. I pulled with everything I had, screaming with exertion. The wheel groaned, a screech of metal on metal that sounded like a dying animal, and turned a quarter rotation. A blast of sub-zero air exploded from the pipes, knocking me flat onto the grating. The temperature dropped instantly. The air turned into a fog of ice crystals. I lay there for a second, gasping, waiting for the relief of success. But the building wasn't done with me. The dragging sound got closer. I scrambled up and looked at the valve. It was turning back. The pressure was too high. The valve wouldn't hold the closed position on its own. The vibration of the pipes was rattling it loose. I grabbed the wheel again, forcing it closed. I had to hold it. I had to manually keep the seal until what? Until the pressure stabilized? Until the shift ended? The dragging stopped just outside the circle of my flashlight's beam. I could hear heavy, wet breathing. It sounded like lungs full of fluid trying to inhale. Hold it, a voice whispered. Not from the dark, but from the pipe itself. Hold it, or join them. I held the wheel. The cold was agonizing. I could feel frostbite setting in. the tips of my fingers turning waxy and hard. The pain traveled up my arms, a dull ache that throbbed in time with my heart. I was sacrificing my hands to keep that thing in the dark from reaching me. This was the bargain. My flesh for the facility's security. Is this what you want? I yelled into the darkness. You want me to freeze? The thing in the dark chuckled, a wet, gurgling sound. A hand reached into the light. It was the gray, calloused hand I'd seen at the loading dock, but now I saw the arm attached to it. The skin was translucent, showing black veins pumping sludge. It reached out, not for me, but for the meat Cleaver the First had dropped on the grate. It picked up the weapon. I couldn't let go of the wheel. If I did, the temperature would rise, and that thing, and all its friends, will be fully free. But if I stayed, I was a sitting duck. The entity stepped fully into the light. It was a patchwork of nightmares. A human torso sewn on the legs that bent backward like a goat's. Its face a smooth mask of scar tissue with no eyes. Only a vertical slit for a mouth. It held the cleaver delicately, tilting its head as if listening to the pipes. It raised the cleaver. I squeezed my eyes shut and screamed, bracing for the blow. I shoved the wheel with the last ounce of my strength, jamming my knee into the spokes to lock it, and threw myself backward. The cleaver came down, sparking against the metal pipe where my hands had been a millisecond before. The entity wasn't attacking me. It was attacking the pipe. It chopped down again, severing a small pressure line. A jet of liquid nitrogen, or whatever supernatural coolant this place used, sprayed directly into the creature's face. It shrieked, a sound that wasn't sound but a frequency that made my teeth ache. The liquid froze it instantly, turning the monstrosity into a statue of gray flesh and ice. The creature toppled over, shattering into 1,000 pieces on the metal grate. The valve shuddered and settled. The pressure stabilized. The ambient hum of the tunnel changed from a chaotic roar to a steady, low drone. The thawing had stopped. The cracks in the ice sealed themselves. I looked at my hands. They were blue, the skin blistered and raw. I had frostbite bad, but I was alive. The tunnel began to retract. The optical illusion, or spatial distortion, collapsed. The walls rushed toward me. The darkness receded, and with a feeling of intense vertigo, I fell forward. I landed face first on the quarry tiles of the kitchen. I scrambled around. The door to the walk-in freezer was closed. The temperature gauge on the frame read -10 degrees. The scratching was gone. The silence was absolute. I lay on the floor, cradling my frozen hands, sobbing dry, terrified tears. I had survived the freezer. I had appeased the boiler room logic of this hellhole. But as I looked up, I realized the building had taken its pound of flesh. My hands were useless claws, stiff and agonizingly painful as the blood began to return to them. I crawled toward the prep table and pulled myself up. I needed warm water. I needed to leave. But escape wasn't an option. The exit signs over the double doors weren't glowing red anymore. They were glowing a deep, malevolent purple. And beneath the word exit, the plastic lettering had rearranged itself to spell "No breaks." A printer in the corner of the kitchen whirred to life. It was a receipt printer, the kind used for food orders. It began to spit out a long, continuous ribbon of paper that pooled on the floor. I stumbled over to read it. Order 66. Cleanliness is next to godliness. The patrons have left a mess in the dining hall. The fluids must be mopped before they stain reality. Use the mop from Closet B. Do not use water. Use the solution provided in the unmarked jerry can. Warning, the stains will try to move. I looked at my watch. It was only 2:15 a.m. This sacrifice of human safety wasn't just a metaphor. The building had demanded my hands to fix the cold, and now it demanded my labor to clean up its horrors. I was injured, terrified, and exhausted, but the chilling realization settled over me like a shroud. I wasn't an employee. I was a component, and components are replaced when they break. I looked at the mop closet. I looked at my ruined hands. I had to figure out how to hold a mop handle without screaming, because if the stains in the dining hall were anything like the things in the freezer, I didn't want to be around when they decided to move. "All right," I whispered, my voice shaking. "All right, you bastard of building." Round 3. I moved toward the closet, my footsteps heavy. The atmosphere had shifted. It wasn't just scary anymore. It was oppressive, a physical weight. The shadows in the corners of the kitchen seemed to be leaning in, watching, evaluating my performance. I was being graded on a curve of survival, and I had a feeling the final exam was going to be a killer. As I grabbed the handle of the mop bucket, I noticed something sticking out of the wringer. It was a human finger. Fresh. I didn't scream. I didn't drop it. I just numbly plucked it out and tossed it into the trash. That was the most terrifying part of all, the compliance. The horror was becoming routine. I was adapting to the madness, and that scared me more than the monsters. If I made it out of here, would I ever be able to function in the real world again? Or does a part of you stay in the night shift forever? I wheeled the bucket out into the dining hall. The lights were flickering again, casting long, dancing shadows across the tables. And there, in the center of the aisle, was the mess. It wasn't food. It was a pool of black, viscous liquid that pulsed like an open wound. And as I watched, a face formed in the surface of the puddle, looked at me, and screamed silently. "Just dirt," I told myself, dipping the mop into the chemical-smelling bucket. Just dirt. But I knew better. We were way past dirt. We were scrubbing the sins of the earth, one tile at a time. I stood before the pool of black liquid, the mop handle feeling like a burning rod in my frostbitten hands. The face in the sludge had dissolved back into the oily surface, but the silent screams still echoed in my mind. This solution in a bucket, a liquid that smelled of formaldehyde and crushed violets, swirled violently, reacting to the proximity of the stain. I had entered a phase of the night where fear had calcified into a grim, mechanical determination. This wasn't panic anymore. It was the soldier's trudge, the mindless forward momentum of someone who knows stopping means death. Rule: the stains will try to move. I slapped the wet mop onto the floor. The moment the chemically soaked strands touched the black puddle, the liquid hissed and recoiled. It didn't splash. It contracted, pulling itself together like a living organism trying to avoid a burn. "Stay still," I growled, pressing the mop down harder. The stain fought back. Tendrils of black ichor shot out, wrapping around the mop head, trying to climb the handle. I stomped on them with my heavy work boots, the thick soles squelching against the unnatural substance. It felt like stepping on jellyfish, yielding, yet resistant. I scrubbed with a violence born of desperation, forcing the stain to retreat, to dissolve under the assault of the purple solution. As I worked, I began to see the pattern. The stains weren't random. They were arranged in a circle around table 7. And table 7 was laid out for a meeting. Not a meal, a meeting. There were pads of paper, old, yellowed legal pads like the one my rules were written on, at each of the 4 chairs. And in the center of the table sat an old-fashioned rotary phone, its cord severed. I finished mopping the last of the black slime, panting heavily. My hands throbbed with a dull, sickening rhythm. The floor was clean, but the air above table 7 was charged with static electricity. The hairs on my arms stood up. I heard footsteps, not the heavy, monstrous treads from the freezer, but the sharp, purposeful click-clack of dress shoes on linoleum. I backed away into the shadows of the vending machine alcove. I wasn't supposed to be part of this meeting. I was the help, the janitor. My job was to prepare the space and disappear. From the hallway leading to the executive offices, a part of the building that had been boarded up for a decade, 3 figures emerged. They were translucent, shimmering like mirages, but their details were sharp. They wore suits from the late 70s, wide lapels, brown and mustard tones. Their faces were gray, their eyes sunk in pits of shadow. They didn't walk. They glided, their feet barely touching the freshly mopped floor. They took their seats at table 7. "The numbers don't add up, gentlemen," one of them said. His voice sounded like it was coming through a crushed radio speaker, tinny and distorted. "The overhead is too high," the second one replied, gesturing with a hand that trailed smoke. "The cost of containment is exceeding the projected revenue. We need to cut the budget," the third one said. He turned his head slowly, and for a terrifying second, his hollow eyes locked onto the vending machines where I was hiding. "We need to reduce the staff." I held my breath. They were talking about the haunting. They were discussing the facility like it was a failing business, and the supernatural horrors were just line items on a ledger. "The night shift is the problem," the first figure continued. "High turnover. Too many accidents. We need a permanent solution." "Agreed. A permanent vessel." The rotary phone in the center of the table rang. It didn't have a cord, but it rang. A harsh, mechanical braying that made the figures jump. The first figure picked up the receiver. "Management," he said. He listened for a moment. His gray face somehow paled, turning a shade of translucent white. "Yes, sir. I understand. The vessel is ready. He is resilient." He hung up. All 3 figures turned their heads in unison to look directly at me. "The audit is complete," the first figure said. "The candidate has passed the stress test." They stood up, and then they exploded. It wasn't a fiery explosion. They simply burst into clouds of dust and moths. Hundreds of gray moths swarmed the air, filling the cafeteria with the sound of fluttering wings. They spiraled upward, vanishing into the ventilation ducts. I stood there, trembling. The candidate, permanent vessel. They weren't just hazing me. They were testing me. They wanted to see if my body could handle the strain of the haunting, because they wanted to keep me, not as an employee, but as part of the infrastructure. A battery, a vessel. I looked at the clock. 3:30 a.m. The realization gave me a new kind of clarity. I wasn't fighting to survive the night anymore. I was fighting to keep my soul from being welded to the foundation of this cursed building. A sudden, loud clank came from the kitchen. Then another. The sound of metal hitting metal. It was rhythmic, industrial. I walked back toward the kitchen, my dread replaced by a cold fury. I wasn't going to let them take me. When I pushed through the swinging doors, the kitchen had changed again. The prep tables were gone. In their place was a conveyor belt that ran the length of the room, disappearing into the wall where the walk-in freezer used to be. The belt was moving. On the belt were plates, but they weren't holding food. They held personal items. A wallet, a set of keys, a single shoe. A photograph of a smiling family. I watched as a wallet glided past. It was mine. My breath hitched. I patted my back pocket. Empty. Then came my keys. My car keys. Then a photo. It was a picture of me and my sister from last Christmas. The building was stripping me. It was taking my identity, item by item, and feeding it into the machine. If those items went through the wall, I had a feeling I would forget who I owned them. I would forget who I was. I would become just another shadow at table 7. No, I snarled. I ran to the conveyor belt. Rule or no rule, I am not losing myself. I grabbed my wallet. The moment my fingers touched it, a jolt of electricity surged through me, throwing me back. I hit the floor hard. Interference detected. A mechanical voice boomed from the ceiling. Processing accelerated. The belt sped up. My keys and the photo were rushing toward the hole in the wall. I scrambled up. I couldn't touch them directly. The belt was protected. I looked around wildly. I needed something to knock them off. My eyes landed on the unmarked jerry can of cleaning solution I had used earlier. I grabbed the can. It was heavy. I didn't try to pour it. I swung the entire metal can like a club. I smashed it into the conveyor belt mechanism. Metal crunched. Sparks flew. The belt shuddered but didn't stop. Stop! I screamed, swinging again. I hit the gears exposed on the side. The can ruptured, spraying the purple, foul-smelling liquid into the motor. The machine shrieked. A human shriek. The motor seized. Smoke billowed out. The belt jerked to a halt just inches before my photo disappeared into the darkness of the wall. I used the handle of the mop to sweep my items off the belt onto the floor. I scooped them up, shoving them deep into my pockets, patting them to make sure they were real. They felt warm, vibrating slightly. Processing failed, the voice said. It sounded disappointed. Initiating termination protocol. The lights died. All of them. Even the exit signs. The kitchen was plunged into a darkness so deep it felt like being buried alive. Then, a red light began to pulse from the floor. It was coming from the drains. A deep, blood-red glow that cast long, terrifying shadows upward. From the drains, they began to rise. Not ghosts, not monsters, but the previous night's shift workers. They were soaked in slime, wearing tattered uniforms with name tags that read Steve, Maria, David. Their eyes were sewn shut. Their mouths were fused together. They moved with a jerky, puppet-like gait, their limbs snapping into place. They were the ones who hadn't passed the test, or maybe the ones who had passed, and this was their reward. Eternal service. There were dozens of them. They filled the kitchen, blocking the exit to the dining hall. They didn't attack. They just stood there, forming a wall of flesh and uniform. Then they all pointed. They pointed toward the back door, the loading dock, the only way out. But to get there, I had to go through them. I looked at the meat cleaver still lying on the floor where I had dropped it. I picked it up. My hands were screaming in pain, but adrenaline masked the worst of it. I quit, I said to the room. I charged. I didn't hack at them. I shoulder-checked the first one, a guy named Steve. He felt like a bag of wet sand. He stumbled back, knocking into the others. They weren't strong individually, but they were a mass. Hands grabbed at my clothes, cold, clammy fingers tried to pull me down into the red-lit crowd. I kicked. I shoved. I swung the flat of the cleaver to push them back. I was wading through a sea of the lost. I could hear them moaning, a low, vibratory sound trapped behind their sealed lips. It was a sound of pure misery. I broke through the line, stumbling into the corridor, leading to the loading dock. I didn't look back. I could hear the wet slapping of their feet chasing me. I reached the loading dock door, the one I'd seen the giant hand reach through earlier. It was closed now. I slammed my body against the crash bar. Locked. Of course it was locked. I fumbled for my keys, the keys I had just rescued from the conveyor belt. I found a master key on the ring. My hand was shaking so badly I dropped them. Clatter. The shuffling footsteps were getting closer. I dropped to my knees, scrabbling in the dark for the keys. My fingers brushed the cold metal. I grabbed them. I jammed the key into the deadbolt. It wouldn't turn. "Come on," I sobbed. "Come on." The first of the former workers rounded the corner. In the red gloom, he looked pathetic and terrifying. He reached out a hand. "Joel, U.S." The words formed in his throat without his lips moving. I twisted the key with both hands, ignoring the pain of my frostbite. Click. The bolt slid back. I kicked the door open. The night air of the Texas desert hit me. It was hot, dry, and smelled of sagebrush. It was the most beautiful thing I had ever smelled. But as I stepped out onto the concrete ramp, I stopped. The parking lot wasn't empty. Standing in the center of the lot, illuminated by the single flickering street lamp, was Mr. Vance, the manager. He was standing next to his truck, holding a clipboard. He looked at his watch, then up at me. He didn't look surprised. He looked resigned. "You're early, Elias," he called out. His voice carried across the silent lot. "The shift doesn't end until the sun comes up." "I'm done," I yelled, stumbling down the ramp. "I'm leaving. You can keep your check." Vance shook his head slowly. "You don't understand, son. You can't leave. Not yet." He pointed a finger at the building behind me. I turned around. The cafeteria wasn't there. Where the building should have been, there was just a massive, gaping hole in reality. A tear in the sky, ragged and bleeding static, hanging over the concrete slab foundation. And inside that tear I could see gears. Massive, celestial gears turning slowly, grinding against each other. And caught in the teeth of those gears were people. "The building is just the interface," Vance said, his voice sounding suddenly very close, right in my ear, though he was 50 feet away. "The work is real, and you haven't punched out." I looked down at my chest. I was wearing a name tag. It didn't say Elias anymore. It said manager. I looked back at Vance. He was fading. His body was turning into dust, blowing away in the desert wind. "Congratulations on the promotion," his voice whispered on the breeze. The tear in the sky pulsed. The gears ground louder. The staff, the zombies in the hallway, were standing at the edge of the tear, watching me, waiting for orders. I wasn't a victim anymore. I was the warden. The previous warden had just been released, and the night was still young. I had a lot of paperwork to do, and the first rule of management: never let the staff see you bleed. I gripped the keys in my hand. They were warm. They were heavy. They were mine now. I turned back to the tear in the world. "All right," I said, my voice hollow. "Back to work." But I wasn't going back in to clean. I was going back in to change the rules. Because if I was the manager now, then this hellhole was going to run on my schedule. Or so I hoped. I turned my back on the freedom of the desert night and stepped across the threshold, back into the maw of the Ironwood Industrial Complex. The air inside didn't feel like air anymore. It felt like pressurized static, a heavy, electric blanket that made the hair on my arm stand up and stay there. The transition was instantaneous. One moment, I was standing on a concrete ramp under the stars. The next, I was inside the tear, standing on a floor that was no longer linoleum, but a translucent, shifting surface revealing the colossal, grinding gears of the machine below. The staff, those silent, uniformed cadavers with their eyes sewn shut, didn't attack me. As I walked past them, clutching the heavy ring of keys that Mr. Vance had bequeathed to me, they parted like a grotesque Red Sea. They turned their heads to follow my movement, their postures stiffening into something resembling respect, or perhaps terrified obedience. I wasn't just me to them anymore. I was the hand that held the leash. "Back to your stations," I said. My voice didn't sound like my own. It boomed, amplified by the acoustics of the void, carrying a metallic resonance that vibrated in my chest bones. The figures hesitated for a fraction of a second. A test, I realized. They were testing the weight of my command. I didn't flinch. I glared at the one named Steve, projecting every ounce of my anger and fear into a single psychic shove. The entity stumbled back as if hit by a physical blow, bowed its head, and shuffled rapidly toward the dish pit. The others followed suit, dissolving into the shadows of the kitchen to resume their eternal, nonsensical tasks. I walked toward the manager's office. Before, it had been a glass box of mundane paperwork. Now, as I approached, the glass was opaque, pulsing with a dark, violet light. I inserted the master key into the lock. It turned with a wet, organic click like snapping a finger joint. I pushed the door open and stepped into the brain of the beast. The office was vast, far larger than it appeared from the outside. The walls were lined not with filing cabinets, but with floor-to-ceiling servers that hummed with a sound like a choir of whispering voices. Cables, thick as pythons, snaked across the floor, pulsing with bioluminescent fluid. In the center of the room sat a desk made of some dark, polished stone that looked uncomfortably like obsidian. On the desk lay the logbook. It wasn't the yellow legal pad I'd seen earlier. This was a massive tome bound in a leather that was too pale, too soft. I didn't want to think about where it came from. I sat in the high-back chair. It contoured to my body instantly, cold tendrils of energy seeping into my spine, connecting me to the facility's nervous system. I gasped as the vision hit me. I didn't just see the cafeteria. I felt it. I felt the pressure in the pipes, the cold in the freezer, the hunger in the walls. I felt the tectonic grinding of the gears below, churning the metaphysical refuse of the universe. This wasn't cafeteria. It was a processing plant. It took the negative energy, the lost souls, the gluttony and despair of the world, and ground it down into fuel. And I was the operator. I looked down at the logbook. The pages were filled with handwriting that shifted and changed styles as I watched. I saw entries from 1974, 1890, 2024. Time was fluid here. I saw Vance's handwriting, jagged and frantic near the end. Entry 11,402. The gears are hungry. The intake valve is clogged. I don't have enough soul matter to keep the pressure down. I'm losing containment. Then beneath that, in fresh, wet ink that smelled of iron. Entry 11,403. New management installed. Vessel, Elias. Status, resilient. System stabilizing. I was the patch. I was the software update that kept the machine from exploding. Okay, I whispered, grabbing a fountain pen from the desk. It was heavy, made of bone. If I'm running this place, we're making some changes. I needed to survive until dawn. The sun was the only thing that forced the facility into its dormant state. But the board of directors, those smoky entities from Table 7, wouldn't make it easy. They wanted to see if I would break. The intercom on the desk buzzed. It wasn't a button. It was a small, speaker-like grill embedded in the stone. Manager Elias. The distorted voice of the first director croaked. Production is down. The entities in the freezer require sustenance. Authorize a release of the containment protocols. They wanted me to let the monsters out, to let them roam free and feed on whatever they could find. Likely me, or the poor souls in the town 40 miles away. Authorization denied. I said, my hand gripping the bone pen until my knuckles turned white. The pressure will build, the voice warned. If you do not vent the system, the foundation will crack. You will be consumed. Let it build, I snarled. I'll handle the pressure. I closed my eyes and focused on the connection in my spine. I could feel the freezer. The pressure was immense, a physical headache that threatened to split my skull. The things inside were screaming, banging against the door. I visualized the door. I visualized the lock. I poured my will into it, imagining the steel fusing together, becoming a solid wall of diamond. Hold! The building groaned. The servers in the room sparked. The floor beneath the desk shook violently. Rule 1 of the new management, I wrote in the book, my hand moving automatically. No one eats unless I say so. The shaking intensified. A crack appeared in the stone wall of the office. Smoke began to pour in, the moth dust of the directors. They were coming to remove me. I stood up. You want a show? I yelled at the walls. I'll give you a show. I grabbed the master key again. There was a small, red key on the ring I hadn't used yet. It was hot to the touch. I didn't know what it did, but the instinct, the manager's instinct, told me it was the nuclear option. There was a slot on the side of the obsidian desk. I jammed the red key in and twisted. Emergency protocol. Purge. The building didn't explode. It inverted. Gravity shifted. I was thrown to the ceiling, which was now the floor. The moth cloud of the directors was sucked into the ventilation shafts with a shriek of outrage. The cafeteria outside the office underwent a violent transformation. The tables, the chairs, the serving counters, they were all sucked into the central tear in reality, ground up by the gears, and then spat back out, reassembled. The pressure in my head vanished. The screams from the freezer stopped, replaced by a low, terrified whimper. I had flushed the system. I had cycled the energy so violently that even the ghosts were disoriented. I fell back into the chair as gravity righted itself. I was panting, sweat dripping onto the logbook. My hands were black and blue, the frostbite throbbing, but I was alive. I looked at the clock on the wall. The hands were spinning wildly, but then they slowed, clicked, and settled. 5:58 a.m. Almost there, I wheezed. The atmosphere in the room changed. The violet light faded, replaced by the sterile, fluorescent hum of the mundane office. The servers retracted into the walls, becoming filing cabinets once more. The obsidian desk lightened, turning into cheap particle board. The connection to my spine severed with a sharp, stinging pain, like a Band-Aid being ripped off a hairy arm. I slumped forward, the weight of the human world returning to my shoulders. Through the window of the office, I saw the darkness of the desert turning into a bruised purple, then a bleeding orange. The sun was cresting the horizon. The staff in the kitchen froze mid-step. They didn't disappear. They just ceased to be supernatural. Steve wasn't a zombie anymore. He was just a mop bucket that had been left in the middle of the floor. The figure near the stove was just a pile of dirty aprons. The monsters receded, hiding in the cracks of the daylight, waiting for the rotation of the earth to bring them back. The shift was over. I stood up, my legs shaking. I grabbed the keys. I grabbed the logbook, which was now just a yellow legal pad again, and shoved it into my bag. I walked out of the office. The cafeteria was silent. It was messy, dirty, and smelled of stale food, but it was just a cafeteria. The tear in the reality was gone. The gears were silent. I walked to the time clock by the loading dock. I took my card. Ka-chunk. 6:01 a.m. I pushed the loading dock door open. The morning heat hit me, a physical embrace. I walked down the ramp to my car, a beat-up sedan that looked like the most beautiful chariot I had ever seen. I got in, my hands fumbling with the ignition. The engine roared to life. I drove. I drove fast. I didn't look in the rearview mirror until I was 10 miles down the highway. When I finally looked, the Ironwood Industrial Complex was just a small, gray smudge against the vastness of the Texas scrubland. I laughed. It started as a chuckle and turned into a hysterical, sobbing laugh that hurt my ribs. I had made it. I had beaten the house. I pulled into the parking lot of a diner in the next town over. I needed coffee. I needed to see normal people. I walked inside, the bell above the door jingling cheerfully. A waitress named Brenda poured me a mug of black coffee. "Rough night, sugar?" she asked, eyeing my bruised hands and the dark circles under my eyes. "You have no idea," I said, blowing on the steam. I reached into my bag to grab my wallet to pay. My hand brushed against the yellow legal pad. I pulled it out, intending to throw in the trash. I wanted to burn it, but as I looked at the top page, my blood ran cold. The ink was fresh. It wasn't my handwriting. It was the jagged, frantic scrawl of the building. Rule 1 for the day shift manager. You can leave the building, Elias, but the building never leaves you. See you at sundown. Don't be late. The board hates tardiness. I froze. I looked down at my coffee. The liquid in the mug rippled. Boom, boom, boom. A tiny, rhythmic thumping coming from inside the cup. I looked up at Brenda. Her smile was frozen. Her eyes didn't blink. For a second, just a split second, her face flickered, revealing the gray, hollow features of the entities from Table 7. Then she was Brenda again. "Everything okay, hon?" she asked. I slowly lowered the cup. I looked around the diner. The patrons were eating, but their movements were synchronized. Fork to mouth. Chew. Swallow. Fork to mouth. Like gears. I wasn't free. I hadn't escaped. I had just expanded the perimeter. Mr. Vance hadn't died. He hadn't turned to dust. He had been released. He had passed the burden to me. And in doing so, he had severed the connection. But I had accepted the keys. I had sat in the chair. I had written in the book. I belonged to the Ironwood complex now. The entire world was just a waiting room for my next shift. I stood up, leaving a $20 bill on the table. "I have to go," I said, my voice flat. "I have to get some sleep. See you tonight." Brenda called out cheerfully. "Yeah," I whispered, walking out into the blinding Texas sun. "See you tonight." I got back into my car. I didn't drive home. I drove to a hardware store. I bought a new set of chains, a heavier padlock, and a box of industrial chalk. If I was going to be the manager of hell, I needed supplies. I drove back toward the complex. The sun was high, but I could already feel the cold creeping into my bones, the phantom chill of the freezer waiting for me. The hook was set. The contract was signed in blood and frost. I wasn't just a survivor anymore. I was the keeper of the gate. And as I looked at the horizon, watching the shadows stretch long and thin across the desert, I realized the scariest truth of all. I was looking forward to it. The gears were calling, and I had a lot of new rules to write.